ICAN is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and so that's a global network of organizations from around the world. As of yesterday, we hit 100 countries because an organization in Iceland joined, so we're quite excited. We have about 400 groups from 100 countries, and the goal of ICAN for the last 7 years roughly has been to get states to negotiate a legally binding treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about. The overall goal of ICAN as a campaign, and also WILP as an organization, is of course the total elimination of nuclear weapons. But we decided in the campaign to focus on this specific treaty at this time for a number of reasons. For those of you that work on nuclear weapons or follow that issue at all, you might know that it's been incredibly difficult to get the states that possess nuclear weapons to show any interest in disarmament whatsoever. And in fact, despite, you'll read in the media a few years ago about Obama and Putin reaching agreement for some bilateral reductions of their arsenals, but those were quite minimal. There's been no progress since then. The rest of the nuclear-armed states have said they're not going to get rid of their arsenals until the US and Russia bring theirs down to roughly their numbers. So it's just been stalemated. At the same time, every country that possesses nuclear weapons, which is 9 of them, by the way, I should say, it's first of all, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, which is a problem. So that's the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And then also India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea have nuclear weapons. So these 9 countries, while they're refusing to disarm, they have actually been investing billions and billions of dollars into the modernization of their nuclear weapons systems. Obama actually committed more money than any government since Reagan's on nuclear weapons. He committed $1 trillion in the last budget. I think that's right, Alicia? Alicia knows all the figures better than I do. And they all have sort of these ongoing programs to update the systems, the weapons themselves, but also the missiles that carry them, the bombers that carry them. So it's really expansive programs. We're actually going in the opposite direction of disarmament. The 5 members of the Security Council that have nuclear weapons, they're actually legally obligated under another treaty called the NonProliferation Treaty to disarm. And that's been in existence since 1970, but they've refused to comply with that obligation. So every year, states gather at the UN at a meeting and talk about the need to implement this treaty. The rest of the world has signed on to all these non-proliferation measures, things they have to do to make sure that nuclear weapons don't spread to other countries. And all of that's been going fairly well, but unfortunately the disarmament aspect of the treaty hasn't been negotiated. So we're NGOs, we're looking at this situation. We can't physically walk into a nuclear-armed state and say, you have to give up your nuclear weapons. No other government can do that. They're getting really frustrated, angrier and angrier. So we started thinking about what can we do? What end run around this situation can we do to affect things, shake things up, make a bit of a scene? And a small group of countries decided that maybe a good way to go was to look at how other weapon systems have been banned. So landmines were banned in 1996, and cluster munitions were banned in 2008. And the way that that happened was a small group of countries that really were concerned with the way these weapons were killing civilians, undermining human rights. They got together and developed a prohibition treaty for these weapons, even though major users and producers like the United States and other countries didn't want this treaty to happen and didn't want to sign on. They went ahead and did it anyway. And what happened over time was US policy, the policy of other users and producers became affected by the treaty, even though they'd refused to participate in the negotiations, and then they refused to join the treaty after it had entered into force, but their behavior was still affected. And we've seen that even very recently with the US on cluster munitions, where it decided that it wouldn't export them anymore. And the last producer of cluster munitions in the United States actually decided last year to stop producing them because of Saudi Arabia using them in Yemen, and it took a lot of political flack for that, and the media started paying attention to the issue again. So we've seen the way that the normative development of expectations of behavior, what that can do to countries, even if they're not bound by the actual treaty law. And so the same countries that led the initiative on landmines and cluster munitions started looking at nuclear weapons. Why can't we do that with nuclear weapons? We're always told they're so different because only a few states have them, and of course they're the most destructive weapon in the world. But that's exactly why countries that care about human rights and international law need to do something about it. So we had a few brave countries that decided to start very tentatively with conferences, which is always the way that you start in the diplomatic scene. You hold a meeting. And so Norway hosted a meeting in Oslo in 2014. This is after, I should say, after 4 years of advocacy from civil society at the UN, and getting states to sign on to statements saying that they wanted, that they were concerned about the humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons. So I'm skipping ahead a bit, but 4 years it took of statement writing and sign-ons to gather enough momentum for Norway to feel it could hold a conference. So it did. And it was on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and it said that it wanted to bring together experts to look at what nuclear weapons do, even a single detonation of a nuclear weapon, what it does to the environment, to human beings, to the economy, etc. The UN Security Council members with nuclear weapons boycotted it as a group. They said it was ridiculous to hold such a conference. Russia said even children know what nuclear weapons do to human beings, so why do we need to have a meeting on it? Which, of course, well, if you know what they do, why don't you get rid of them, because they're terrible. But almost all other countries in the world went to this meeting in Oslo. Mexico held one to follow up from that. And at the Mexico meeting, they went even further by the end of it, and the Mexican government said something has to be done. We need something legal on nuclear weapons, something new. And Austria took it from there. And at the end of the Austrian conference in 2014, they put out this pledge that was under their national capacity. So it was just Austria all by itself, because they didn't want to anger anybody who was at the meeting, and said that they wanted to fill the legal gap on nuclear weapons, which was, you know, usefully vague for their purposes, to allow us to articulate a narrative for what that legal gap should be after the meeting. It changed into what we now call the Humanitarian Pledge, which we got over 120 countries to sign on to ahead of this the October meeting that Florindo mentioned. And so the purpose of that was to go around the world over the next year, basically building up the expectation that a new treaty needed to be negotiated. The way that the Austrians had worded it, it wasn't explicitly a treaty banning nuclear weapons. It was this idea of filling the legal gap, which gave us a lot of space because some countries were very nervous about this idea of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. The United States and the UK had already picked up the scent of what Austria and Mexico were trying to do and were actively lobbying against it. So it was fortunate to not use that term at that time, which is how things go sometimes in diplomacy. But through that process of going around to countries, getting them to sign on to this pledge, it built up an expectation in their capitals that negotiations on a new treaty were going to happen. And then in Geneva last year, the UN hosted a series of meetings in which they were discussing what that treaty should be. And coming out of that and into the General Assembly in October, it was clear that it was going to be a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Now, what this means is, or what we expect this to mean, is a treaty that is prohibiting all aspects of nuclear weapons. So possessing them, testing them, researching and developing them, transferring them, relying on them in your security doctrines, financially investing in companies that produce them. Basically, a total prohibition of any nuclear weapon-related activity. But the key thing about it is that it's not an elimination treaty itself. So we're not expecting the nuclear armed states to come to the negotiations and agree to eliminate their arsenals. This idea is to circle around the nuclear armed states, codify a stigma of their nuclear weapons publicly, legally, politically, and economically, make it more difficult for them to possess nuclear weapons, upgrade them, modernize them, whatever they want to do with them, and codify the rejection of nuclear weapons as an instrument of security. Most of the world has already rejected this, but it's sort of in statements here or agreements here that are regional. It's not codified in one legally binding agreement amongst the majority of countries in the world. And this is the idea that we put to the General Assembly this fall, and this is what states voted on. And you know, it's one of these things in diplomacy that is really hard to calculate and anticipate. It took years for us to get to the point where they were going to have a meeting on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. It took more years after that to get them to agree that they needed a new treaty to deal with this problem. And it took them even longer to say the words banning nuclear weapons or prohibiting nuclear weapons. And all of a sudden, a tipping point happened in 2016 where we got over 120 countries saying that they wanted a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, even if the nuclear armed states wouldn't join in the negotiations. And at the General Assembly, we had 123 countries vote in favor of this. That was despite extremely active lobbying by the United States in particular, but also by France and by Russia. There was a lot of scaremongering going on, a lot of threatening going on. The United States even had their highest levels of diplomats come to the UN and counter-lobby against this resolution at the General Assembly. We had statements from almost all of the states possessing nuclear weapons condemning these negotiations, ridiculing states that were leading this initiative, became very personal and undiplomatic at the General Assembly this fall. It was actually quite shocking at some points. There were some off-the-record statements that really floored all of us that we weren't allowed to tweet about, which was too bad. But it basically the gloves came off and they lost. They lost anyway, despite all the fear-mongering. And the negotiations are going to begin this year. The first round is going to be in March, the last week of March. That's probably going to be mostly a place for states to come and say what they want to be in the treaty. After that, there will be a draft text developed, and that's what will be negotiated in June and July this year. For the Prohibition Treaty, that's one of the great things about it, is we don't actually need an intrusive or comprehensive verification system, because at this point, this treaty isn't about the actual technical, physical elimination. So if nuclear armed states want to join on to the ban treaty later, or are compelled through this sort of normative and stigmatizing effects of the treaty, and the economic effects of the treaty, if they're compelled to agree to disarmament, which is what we want, that's our ultimate goal, then we're going to need verification provisions for sure for the actual dismantlement of nuclear weapons, particularly in terms of making sure that that is irreversible and transparent. But there's a lot of work going on that already. The United Kingdom and Norway for several years have been running a project looking at how a non-nuclear armed country can help verify disarmament of a nuclear-armed country without any of the sort of technical secrets being passed to the non-armed country. So that project has been going on for years. We get reports from it. It seems like it's going well. Technically feasible, completely technically feasible. We have the International Panel on Fissile Materials, which is run out of Princeton University. They've been doing a number of exercises and studies on how to verify nuclear disarmament. These questions about the transfers of nuclear materials, safety of nuclear materials after disarmament, all of it is technically feasible, and the expertise is there. We just need the countries to agree to disarm, and then we can basically go. So we're ready.
Has everybody, in your opinion, come together to support this initiative in the nuclear disarmament community, all the different groups who've tried different approaches, that they're going to all, get behind this ban treaty and
get
work
on the
really hard?
bandwagon?
Yes.
Wah, wah. Mostly, I would say. There's been, there was a lot of other approaches. There has been, of course, over the years, a number of approaches to deal with this problem. And some groups didn't feel that this was a comprehensive enough approach because it isn't an elimination treaty. But of course, we've been pushing for that for 70 years. So the idea was, what can we do if we're no closer to getting the elimination of nuclear weapons through a treaty negotiated by the nuclear-armed states? In fact, we're further away from it than we've ever been in terms of investments and build-up and that sort of thing. Over the course of the success that we've had in getting this treaty agreed to, we've seen most groups now willing to support it because it is happening, and that's undeniable. A lot of those groups were still not in favor of it up until the point it was adopted, basically at the General Assembly. But now that it's on the table, they're mostly supporting it. But there's still a few that are grumbling, and I hope that everyone comes along and is constructive. And we have this is a great opportunity, I think, for us. The other great thing in terms of growing support for this initiative is that when the treaty was adopted, we've been talking to a lot of the major sort of human rights and environmental groups around the world to get them interested in nuclear weapons. When the resolution was adopted in October, we had statements coming out from Oxfam, Greenpeace, and Amnesty International all supporting it. So that was really great. I hope that they're going to be engaged this year while we negotiate, because they have big, powerful networks, obviously, and connections to a lot of people around the world working on a lot of issues. So that would be really great. It's one of the things, when we started this a few years ago, some of the governments that we were working with that were supportive of this, but hesitant to move on it, really wanted us to bring them mass mobilization, and then they would do the treaty. And we told them, nuh-uh, you got to get us a treaty on the table, and then we can mobilize people, because until then, we have nothing for people to hook onto. Now that we have a treaty, or the negotiations are on the table and about to begin, we can mobilize people around that. And that's the way things went. And then, exactly, we needed this moment to have groups like Amnesty and Greenpeace excited about it.
April 24th, there's a big climate march in D.C. I think, do I have the right day? 29th, April 29th, sorry. Which probably will be really big. I wonder if our different groups could think about how we could use that event to pull people in for the New York mobilization in June.
Yeah, that would
maybe
be
like
really
people spaced out enough that there'd be time to maybe make that more like the climate march idea of bringing lots of different, not make it narrow, but make it wide.
Absolutely. We're going to need people in countries that sign on to the treaty to be making sure that their governments are putting the appropriate pressure on. Because, of course, what it's going to come down to is, is non-nuclear armed states are going to have to do some work. Part of that is when they're having bilateral meetings with the nuclear armed states, they're bringing this up, they're making it uncomfortable, they're causing a fuss about it. It's going to mean looking at financial investments, and so that's both something for the public to look at and for their governments to look at. We've already started doing divestment work in terms of nuclear weapons, which has been going really well. PAX, this group in the Netherlands, for the last few years has done a global report, Don't Bank on the Bomb, looking at what banks have funds invested in nuclear weapon producing companies, and what companies those are and where they're based, etc. Most of the companies, of course, are in the United States. But the banks that invest in them are global. So that's something that people can do as a local action, is call up your bank, ask if it is investing in any of these companies. And this report is a great tool for that because it shows you what banks are investing in which companies. And even moving your money away from banks that continue to invest in a nuclear weapon production. But then also at the governmental level, we've looked at states that have, say, pension plans, government pension plans that have ethical investments as well. And one of the things that we found interesting is some of these plans, for example, in Australia, the Future Fund, they have divested from cluster munition and landmine producing companies because those weapons are outlawed. And when we've called them to ask why don't they divest from nuclear weapons, they say because they're not illegal. So whenever anybody says nuclear weapons are, we don't need this prohibition treaty, we just need to go for an elimination treaty, this is a clear demonstration of exactly why you need the legal prohibition, because in the public consciousness, they aren't illegal the same way that other weapons are. And it's not that the landmine or cluster munition treaties are universal. They don't have 100% support. The United States has not ratified either of them. But yet, in the public mind, these are illegal weapons. And public companies or public entities see it that way and respond to the public as if they're illegal weapons. So that's sort of a side note onto your question. But yeah, there's going to need to be a lot of awareness about this, and I do agree that independent media is imperative.
But then the next step would at some point be the dismantling treaty?
Yeah, so, there's lots of ways that could go. It could be a separate treaty that the nuclear armed states negotiate amongst themselves. It could be that there's a process for them to join on to the ban treaty later and negotiate with the states parties to the ban treaty a plan to eliminate. So there's a few ways that could go. We don't really mind how it goes as long as it goes. But yeah, the idea is to compel them to that point.
And I've heard that the fuel rods that are used in nuclear plants are used for the weapon system. Is that correct?
No, that's not exactly correct. But so in Japan, they have a big reprocessing industry. And so when you're reprocessing nuclear fuel, that material could be used in a nuclear weapon if it's reprocessed to a certain degree. Same with uranium as well. If you process it to a certain point, then it can be used in a nuclear weapon as opposed to just a nuclear power plant. So it's more about the materials than about the equipment itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you are a nuclear power producing country and you're enriching uranium or reprocessing to plutonium, then those materials could, in theory, be used in a nuclear bomb. But you'd also need a whole other nuclear weapon development program to make that happen. Yes, this treaty won't affect nuclear power. WILC, as an organization, is opposed to nuclear power and supports renewables. But this treaty is only going to address the nuclear weapon aspect of the problem. But I don't think that we can not tackle something like nuclear weapons until we've sorted out all those other problems. I think it's all part of the same project, and I think this is a piece of the puzzle. I think that it has implications that go well beyond nuclear weapons as its own technology. I think we're seeing this from the way that we're trying to develop this particular treaty on nuclear weapons. We're building on a body of law, but also social understandings of violent technologies that have built up over time through the prohibitions of other weapons like biological and chemical weapons. Is the world safe because we outlawed them? No, of course not. There's still many other problems in the world that need to be fixed. But outlawing biological and chemical weapons has provided us with a platform to outlaw nuclear weapons. Same with the cluster munitions, same with landmines. These are all part of humanitarian disarmament geared towards achieving human security, upholding human rights. Does it solve all problems? No, of course not. It's a piece of the puzzle. And I think that understanding its place in the trajectory of the broader social justice movements that we're a part of and the goals that we have to improve ourselves as a species in which we don't just communicate with each other through violence, I think it's all important work. So whatever our particular priorities are, whatever opportunities happen to be open, and this moment, this is the opportunity that's open to us in terms of weapons technologies. So we're trying to seize that whilst putting it into its broader context of peace and justice.